The convoy had been silent for 11 minutes. 11 minutes since the last crackle of static. 11 minutes since Staff Sergeant Marcus Holt had heard anything but his own breath echoing inside his helmet. The mountain pass around them had swallowed every sound except the idling diesel engines and the wind scraping across shattered rock. 23 vehicles stretched along the narrow valley road, boxed in by cliffs on one side and a 200-foot drop on the other. No room to maneuver. No room to turn around. The perfect kill zone, and everyone knew it. Holt stood in the turret of the lead MRAP, scanning the ridgeline through thermals that showed nothing but cold stone and colder sky. His hands were steady on the M2 Browning, but his jaw ached from clenching. Behind him, 2nd Platoon sat in their vehicles, waiting. They'd been waiting since dawn, when the ambush had cut them off from the rest of the battalion. Now it was nearly 1400 hours, and the fog that had rolled in an hour ago wasn't lifting. It was thickening, turning the mountains into ghosts. "Any word from higher?" Private Kessler called up from below. "Negative," Holt said. His voice sounded flat even to himself. The radio burst to short life, a half-second of interference, then nothing. Holt keyed his handset. "Roughneck Maine, this is Roughneck 16, radio check, over." Only static answered. He tried again. Same result. They were alone, and whoever had hit them 4 hours ago knew exactly where they were. The burned-out Humvee 300 meters back proved that. So did the 2 casualties they'd pulled from it, now wrapped in ponchos in the back of a supply truck. Kessler climbed halfway up into the turret, his face pale under the dust. "Sarge, we've got maybe 2 hours of daylight left, maybe less with this fog." Holt didn't answer. He was watching the ridgeline again, that crawling sensation between his shoulder blades that every infantry veteran learns to trust. Movement catches the eye before the brain can process it. He saw nothing, but the feeling didn't fade. Then the radio crackled again, different this time, not static, a voice distant and broken by interference but unmistakably human. "Any station, Eastern Valley, this is. You copy?" Holt grabbed the handset so fast he nearly ripped it from its mount. "Station calling Eastern Valley, this is Roughneck 16, say again your last, over." Silence, then clearer. "Roughneck, this is Gravedigger 71, we're 10 minutes out, sit tight." Holt's breath caught. Gravedigger. He knew that call sign. Every soldier in theater knew it. The name belonged to a Warthog driver, an A-10 pilot who'd been flying close air support missions over these mountains since before half his platoon had even deployed. But the stories around that call sign weren't about the aircraft. They were about the person flying it. And those stories came with skepticism, the kind soldiers reserve for myths they don't quite believe. Because Gravedigger wasn't a man. And in a branch where respect was earned in blood and fire, Captain Nora Vance had been earning hers one-gun run at a time while others still questioned whether she belonged in the cockpit at all. The A-10 Thunderbolt II descended through the fog like something dragged up from an older, meaner war. Angular and ugly, built around a cannon that could shred armored vehicles like paper, it was never meant to be graceful. It was meant to survive, to loiter, to bring hell down on targets that faster jets wouldn't touch. The titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit could take hits from 23 rounds. The twin turbofan engine sat high on the fuselage, protected from ground fire and capable of running on one if the other was destroyed. It was a flying tank, slow and loud and absolutely lethal. Nora Vance sat in that cockpit now, one hand on the stick, the other adjusting her targeting pod as she descended through 3,000 feet. The digital display painted the valley in shades of green and gray. She could see the convoy below, strung out along the road like beads on a string, vulnerable and static. She could also see the heat signatures scattered across the northern ridgeline. 12 of them, maybe more hidden in the rocks. "Roughneck 16, Gravedigger 71, she said, her voice calm and precise. "I've got eyes on your position. I'm also tracking multiple probable hostile positions along your northern ridge, approximately 400 meters from your lead vehicle. Confirm you are unable to maneuver, over." Holt's voice came back immediately, tight with stress. Gravedigger, that's affirmative. We're boxed in. Road's too narrow to turn around, and we've got a sheer drop on our right flank. We tried pushing forward 2 hours ago and took fire from prepared positions. Lost one vehicle. We're stuck here until we can neutralize those positions or get air support to clear a path. Nora zoomed her targeting pod, studying the ridgeline. Whoever had set this up knew what they were doing. The positions were staggered, mutually supporting, with clear fields of fire down into the valley. Any attempt to move would expose the convoy to fire from multiple angles. It was a textbook ambush, patient and professional. That worried her more than anything. "Copy that, Roughneck. Stand by for my assessment," she said. She banked the A-10 into a wide circle, gaining altitude to stay out of effective small arms range while she worked the problem. The fog was making everything harder, reducing visibility to less than a mile in places. But her targeting pod cut through it, infrared sensors painting the landscape in thermal relief. She could see everything they couldn't. Lieutenant Reeves, her squadron operations officer back at Bagram, crackled in on the guard frequency. "Gravedigger 7-1, be advised you are not cleared hot. Rules of engagement require positive identification before engagement. Convoy commander reports no confirmed hostile fire in the last hour. You are authorized for show of force only, over." Nora's jaw tightened. "Understood," she said, keeping her voice neutral. Show of force. It meant flying low, making noise, trying to scare off hostiles without actually engaging. It was a political decision, made by people who weren't sitting in a kill zone watching the sun sink toward the mountains. She understood the calculus minimizing civilian casualties, avoiding international incidents, but she also understood what happened to convoys that stayed pinned down after dark. The enemy owned the night in these mountains, always had. She keyed the radio again. "Roughneck 1-6, Gravedigger. I'm going to make a low pass along your northern flank, see if we can convince whoever's up there to reconsider their life choices. Stay buttoned up." Holt responded immediately. "Roger, Gravedigger, will be ready." Nora pushed the stick forward, bringing the A-10 down through 2,500 feet, then 2,000. The turbofan screamed as she accelerated, the Warthog shaking slightly as it picked up speed. It wasn't built for Speedmax cruise, was barely 300 knots, but it didn't need to be fast. It needed to be terrifying. She came in from the east, just above the fog layer, the A-10 silhouette emerging from the gray like a prehistoric predator. The sound hit first, the distinctive whine of the turbofans, high and piercing, announcing her presence to everyone in the valley. Then the shape itself, unmistakable even through the mist. Straight wings. Twin engines mounted high. The long nose housing the GAU-8 Avenger, 7 barrels of rotating death that every enemy combatant in Afghanistan had learned to fear. From the convoy below, Holt watched through his optic as the Warthog roared past, maybe 300 feet above the ridgeline. The noise was overwhelming, a physical pressure against the chest. He saw muzzle flashes from the ridge brief, scattered, and his heart seized. They were shooting at her. "Gravedigger, you're taking fire," he shouted into the radio. Nora's voice came back steady, almost bored. "Observed. Counting positions now." She banked hard left, bringing the A-10 around in a tight turn that seemed impossible for something so bulky, and came back along the same path. More muzzle flashes. She was counting each one, marking positions in her head, building a tactical picture that would matter when if she got clearance to engage. "Roughneck, I've got 12 confirmed positions. Mix of small arms and what looks like at least one medium machine gun, probably a PKM. They're dug in good, prepared positions with overhead cover. This wasn't set up overnight." She paused, and Holt heard something in her voice he hadn't expected, respect for the enemy's competence. "You're not dealing with amateurs." "Can you take them out?" Kessler asked from below, his voice audible over Holt's radio. Holt keyed his handset. "Gravedigger, what's your ordnance?" "I'm carrying a full combat load," Nora replied. 1,100 rounds of 30 Mike, 4 Mavericks, 2 rocket pods, and a pair of 500-pound JDAMs. I can turn that ridge into a parking lot if I get the word, but right now I'm still waiting for clearance. Frustration edged into Holt's voice despite himself. We're sitting ducks here, Gravedigger, if they decide to rush us after. I know, Nora cut him off gently. I know, Roughneck, I'm working it, just sit tight. She climbed back up to 4,000 feet, circling above the convoy like a watchful bird of prey. Her fuel gauge showed she had maybe 90 minutes of loiter time before she'd have to head back to Bagram for gas. 90 minutes to get clearance, execute the mission, and ensure those soldiers made it out alive. The math was tight, and it got tighter with every passing minute. She switched to the command frequency. Checkmate, Gravedigger 7-1. Request immediate clearance to engage hostile positions endangering friendly ground forces. I have 12 confirmed positions firing on U.S. troops. They are in a static defensive position with no room to maneuver. Without close air support, this convoy will be overrun after nightfall over. The response took nearly a minute, and when it came, it wasn't what she wanted to hear. Gravedigger 7-1, checkmate. Request denied. No confirmed hostile casualties. Rules of engagement require imminent threat to life before authorization. Continue show of force. Maintain overwatch. We are working diplomatic clearance with higher over. Diplomatic clearance. That meant phone calls to Kabul, maybe even back to the Pentagon. It meant committees and lawyers, and people who'd never heard a round snap past their head making decisions about who got to live and who didn't. Nora closed her eyes for just a moment, forcing down the anger that wouldn't help anyone. When she opened them again, her voice was ice. Checkmate, be advised. Threat to friendly forces is imminent. Enemy positions are prepared and in optimal ambush configuration. Fog is reducing visibility. Nightfall in approximately 90 minutes. Without air support, Roughneck convoy will be combat ineffective before dawn. Requesting you expedite that clearance over. Gravedigger, checkmate, copies all. Continue mission, out. Nora sat back in her seat, the A-10 banking gently under her touch as she circled. Below her, 23 vehicles full of soldiers waited in a valley that was slowly becoming their grave, and all she could do was watch. The story of how Nora Vance became Gravedigger had been told enough times that it had calcified into legend, which meant the truth was buried under layers of exaggeration and myth. But the core of it was simple enough, and it started in a place that had nothing to do with flying. She'd grown up in Prescott, Arizona, where her father ran a small aircraft maintenance shop at the municipal airport. By the time she was 12, she could identify every civilian aircraft by sound alone. By 15, she'd logged her first solo flight in a beat-up Cessna 172 that her father kept running more through stubbornness than skill. She was good, naturally good, with a feel for the aircraft that her flight instructor said couldn't be taught. She'd applied to the Air Force Academy straight out of high school, aced the entrance exams, and survived 4 years of military discipline and academic rigor that would have broken most people. Commissioned as a second lieutenant, she'd gone through undergraduate pilot training at Vance Air Force Base, no relation, though everyone made the joke and finished in the top 10% of her class. That should have been enough to guarantee her first choice of aircraft. It wasn't. The fighter assignments went to the men who'd finished around her in the rankings. She got offered a tanker. When she pushed back, politely at first, she was told that close air support was different from air superiority, that it required a specific temperament, and that maybe she should consider transport aircraft where her skills would be better utilized. The subtext was clear enough that even the most generous interpretation couldn't hide it. Women didn't belong in attack aircraft, and certainly not in the A-10, which spent most of its time getting shot at by everything with a trigger. So she'd said yes to the tanker, spent 2 years refueling fighters over the Pacific, and hated every minute of it. Then she'd applied for a transfer to A-10s, been rejected, applied again, been rejected again, and kept applying until someone in the assignment process finally got tired of seeing her name. They gave her a slot at Davis-Monthan for A-10 conversion training, probably expecting her to wash out. She didn't wash out. She excelled. By the end of the course, her instructors were using her gun runs as examples for the rest of the class. Her precision was uncanny, her ability to read a battlefield from 3,500 feet almost supernatural. She could identify targets through smoke and dust, could thread rockets through windows, could put 30-millimeter rounds into a car door from a mile away while pulling 4 GS in a turn. And she did it all with a calmness that unnerved some of her fellow pilots, a focus so complete it seemed to slow time itself. But excellence doesn't always translate to acceptance. When she arrived in theater for her first deployment, the call sign waiting for her wasn't chosen by her squadron mates. It was inherited from an incident 2 weeks before her arrival, a mission where ground forces had been pinned down, taking casualties, and had called for immediate air support. The response time was supposed to be under 30 minutes. It took 50 because the Warthog pilot they'd originally called had mechanical issues and had to RTB. The soldiers who'd been waiting, bleeding in a compound surrounded by enemy fighters, had made dark jokes about needing a gravedigger more than close air support by the time help finally arrived. Someone in the operations center thought it would be funny to assign that call sign to the new pilot, the woman pilot, a little hazing, a reminder that she'd have to prove herself every single day. So gravedigger it was. Nora didn't fight the call sign. She wore it like armor, turned it into something else through sheer repetition and competence. Within 6 months, gravedigger stopped being a joke and became a promise. When ground forces called for her, they knew she'd show up. She'd show up, and she'd stay, circling overhead until every friendly was either extracted or the enemy was destroyed. She'd flown missions where she'd stayed on station for hours, running her fuel so low that she barely made it back to base. She'd taken ground fire more times than she could count, brought the A-10 home with holes in the wings and hydraulics leaking across the tarmac. And she'd never, not once, left soldiers on the ground waiting. The stories spread the way stories do in war zones. The time she'd fired danger close, putting 30-millimeter rounds 20 meters from friendly positions, because there was no other way to break the enemy assault. The mission where she'd made 11 gun runs in a single sortie, expending every round of ammunition she carried, and then staying overhead just to provide reconnaissance until another aircraft could arrive. The night she'd talked a wounded Marine through self-aid while coordinating with medevac, her voice calm and steady over the radio even as she dodged tracers arcing up through the darkness. But with the respect came something else, something harder to define. A distance. Her squadron mates were professional, even friendly, but there was always a gap. She wasn't one of the guys, could never be one of the guys, no matter how many missions she flew or how many lives she saved. In the squadron bar, conversations would shift when she approached, jokes would trail off, and she'd catch looks that ranged from admiration to resentment to something she couldn't quite name. She told herself it didn't matter. The job mattered. The soldiers on the ground mattered. Everything else was noise. And most days she believed it. Most days. Now, circling above the trapped convoy, she checked her fuel again and ran the calculations in her head. 75 minutes of loiter time left, maybe 80 if she pushed it. Sunset in an hour and change. The fog was thickening as the temperature dropped, which would make targeting harder but also provide some concealment for the convoy. Not enough to save them if the enemy decided to attack, but something. She keyed the radio. Roughneck 16, Gravedigger, tactical update. I'm tracking minimal movement from the hostile positions. They're staying put, probably waiting for dark. How's your ammunition status? Holt's voice came back strained. We're good on small arms, but we're down to 3 AT-4s and no javelins. If they bring up armor or technicals, we won't have much to stop them with. Copy, I'll make sure they keep their heads down. And Roughneck, she paused, choosing her words carefully. When we get clearance to engage, I need you to mark your northernmost position with IR strobes. Visibility's degrading, and I don't want any blue on blue. Roger, Gravedigger, will mark on your call. The radio fell silent again, and Nora settled into the rhythm of the orbit. Bank, scan, check fuel, check targeting pod, repeat. It was meditative in a way, this circling, this waiting. Some pilots hated it, the boredom punctuated by moments of extreme violence. But Nora had always found a strange peace in it, a clarity of purpose. Up here, nothing else mattered. Not the politics, not the doubts, not the voices saying she didn't belong. Just the mission. Just the soldiers below, who needed her to be perfect when the moment came. And the moment would come. She knew that with the certainty of someone who'd flown enough combat missions to understand the rhythm of war. The enemy below wasn't going anywhere. They'd waited this long, they'd wait until dark. Then they'd move, and everything would happen very fast. She just had to be ready when it did. The sun was a pale disk sinking toward the western peaks, turning the fog into something luminous and unreal. In the convoy, soldiers checked weapons they'd already checked, redistributed ammunition, and tried not to think about what nightfall would bring. Holt had repositioned his vehicles as best he could, angling them to provide overlapping fields of fire, but there was only so much you could do when you were stuck on a single-lane road with nowhere to go. Private First Class Sarah Chen sat in the back of an MRAP, methodically loading magazines. She'd been a soldier for 11 months, deployed for 4, and this was the first time she'd been in a situation where she genuinely believed she might not see tomorrow. The thought was strangely clarifying. All the petty grievances and homesickness and exhaustion that had consumed her thoughts for weeks had evaporated, leaving only a crystalline awareness of the present moment. The weight of the rifle across her lap. The smell of diesel and gun oil. The sound of Specialist Morrison breathing too fast in the seat across from her. "You good?" she asked him. Morrison nodded, but his hands were shaking as he adjusted his helmet. Yeah, I'm good." He wasn't good. Neither was she. But they'd be good enough when it mattered, because that's what soldiers did. They'd trained for this, drilled until the movements became automatic, so that when fear tried to shut down the thinking brain, muscle memory could take over. The radio squawked and everyone in the vehicle tensed. But it was just Holt, his voice carrying the forced calm of NCOs everywhere. "All roughneck elements, this is 1-6. We've got air support overhead and we're going to sit tight until they clear those positions. Stay alert, stay disciplined, and we'll get through this. 1-6 out." Chen found herself wondering about the pilot up there, circling in the fog. She'd heard the call sign Gravedigger in like everyone else. She'd heard the stories. Some people said the pilot was some kind of savant, gifted with preternatural aim and reflexes. Others said it was all exaggeration, war stories that got bigger with each retelling. A few had made comments about diversity quotas and political correctness when they thought no one was listening. Chen didn't care either way. All she cared about was whether that pilot could do the job. Everything else was just noise. Nora saw them coming before the convoy did. Her targeting pod picked up the heat signatures moving along the northern ridge, crawling through the rocks toward the prepared positions. Reinforcements. She counted them as they moved. 8, 9, 10. They were carrying something heavy, 2 men per object, and when they set them down in the positions, she understood immediately. "Mortars." "Checkmate, Gravedigger 7-1, she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "I have visual on enemy reinforcements moving into positions along the northern ridge. They are setting up what appear to be mortar tubes. Imminent threat to friendly forces. Requesting immediate clearance to engage, over." The response came faster this time, but the answer was the same. "Gravedigger, checkmate. Request denied. Higher is still working diplomatic clearance. Continue overwatch. Do not engage unless fired upon directly, over." Do not engage unless fired upon. As if the mortars being set up weren't themselves an act of aggression. As if waiting for the first rounds to land on the convoy was an acceptable risk. Nora's hands tightened on the stick, knuckles going white. She switched frequencies. Roughneck 1-6, Gravedigger. You need to know, they're setting up mortars on that ridge. Probably 82, maybe bigger. Once they start firing, you're not going to have any cover. I strongly recommend you button up and prepare for indirect fire. Holt's voice came back tight with controlled fear. Copy, Gravedigger. How long do we have? Unknown. Could be 5 minutes, could be 50. Depends on how fast they work and when they get the fire command. She paused, then added, I'm still waiting for clearance to engage. As soon as I get it, those positions are gone. But until then. Until then, we wait, Holt finished for her. Understood. Nora circled higher, trying to get a better angle on the mortar positions. She could see the tubes now, definitely 82 being emplaced with practiced efficiency. Whoever was commanding the enemy forces knew exactly what they were doing. Set up mortars, pin the convoy with indirect fire, then assault with infantry while the Americans were suppressed. It was simple, effective, and would work perfectly if she couldn't stop it. She checked her fuel again. 60 minutes of loiter time. The sun was touching the peaks now, maybe 30 minutes until full dark. The timeline was collapsing, options narrowing. Soon it would be too late for clearance to matter, too late for anything but counting casualties and writing reports. She pulled up the rules of engagement card clipped to her kneeboard, reading through the conditions that would authorize her to fire without clearance. Hostile act, check. Hostile intent, definitely check. Imminent threat to U.S. forces, absolutely check. But the card also included that phrase that had gotten more soldiers killed than any enemy action, unless otherwise directed by higher authority. Higher authority said wait. So she waited, watching soldiers about to die, her fingers resting on the weapon's release, her whole body coiled with the tension of enforced inaction. The first mortar round fell at 16:47 hours, landing 30 meters short of the lead MRAP. The explosion was muffled by the fog, but the pressure wave rolled down the valley like thunder. Before the echo faded, 3 more rounds followed, walking up the road toward the convoy. The fourth one hit 20 meters from Holt's position, showering his vehicle with rock fragments and dirt. Incoming! Someone screamed over the radio, the word almost lost in the chaos of soldiers scrambling for any cover that didn't exist. Nora saw the flash of the mortar launch through her pod, saw the rounds arc up and down, and made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. Probably both. Roughneck Gravedigger is engaging, she said, her voice cutting through the panicked radio traffic with absolute authority. Mark your position with IR strobes now. All personnel take cover. Danger close fire incoming in 30 seconds. She didn't wait for checkmate's approval. Didn't wait for clearance from higher. She simply rolled the A-10 into a dive, selected the GAU-8, and lined up her first gun run on the mortar positions with a precision born from hundreds of hours in the cockpit. The Warthog dropped through the fog like a falling axe, and Nora Vance became Gravedigger in truth, bringing judgment down on an enemy that had made the mistake of threatening her people. The GAU-8 Avenger is not a weapon mounted to an aircraft. It's more accurate to say the A-10 is an aircraft built around the weapon. 7 rotating barrels, each as long as a man is tall, chambered for 30mm rounds that weigh just under 2 pounds each. The rate of fire is variable, but in combat, most pilots select the high setting, 4,200 rounds per minute. That's 70 rounds per second, each one capable of punching through armor plate, concrete, or human flesh with equal indifference. When Nora pulled the trigger, the sound that reached the convoy wasn't a machine gun rattle. It was a roar, a sustained BRRRT that seemed to tear the air itself. The depleted uranium rounds stitched across the northern ridge in a line of explosions, each impact kicking up dirt and rock and pieces of things that had been human moments before. The mortar positions vanished in a cloud of dust and fire. She held the trigger for 3 seconds, 210 rounds, then pulled up hard, the A-10 groaning as she climbed back into the fog. Roughneck Gravedigger off target, assess damage over. Through the dust and fog, Holt saw figures running from the ridge, abandoning their positions. The mortar fire had stopped completely. "Gravedigger, you got them. They're falling back." But Nora was already lining up her second run. "Stay down, roughneck. I'm not done yet." She came in from a different angle this time, firing rockets from her left pod. The 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets streaked down like meteors, impacting across the ridgeline in a chain of explosions that collapsed fighting positions and sent huge chunks of rock tumbling down into the valley. Then she pulled up, circled, and came back with the gun again, methodically destroying every position her targeting pod had marked. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, the northern ridge was silent except for the crackle of small fires and the clatter of falling stones. No movement. No heat signatures except the fatting warmth of destroyed equipment. Nora climbed back to altitude, her hands steady on the stick despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "Roughneck 1-6, Gravedigger. Threat neutralized. You are clear to proceed to your checkpoint. Recommend you move now before they regroup." Holt's voice came back shaky with relief and something that might have been awe. "Roger, Gravedigger. We're moving. Thank you. You saved our asses." "Just doing my job, Roughneck. Get your people home safe. Gravedigger out." She switched to the command frequency, and her voice changed, became flat and professional. "Checkmate, Gravedigger 7-1. Be advised, I engaged hostile forces without clearance under imminent threat to friendly forces. Convoy was taking mortar fire. I had positive ID on enemy positions and engaged with guns and rockets. 12 hostile positions destroyed. Friendly forces are mobile and proceeding to checkpoint. Request you log this engagement and notify higher of row violation. Over." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When the voice came back, it belonged to a different officer, someone more senior. "Gravedigger 7-1, checkmate actual. Copy all. Return to base immediately. Be prepared for debrief. Checkmate out." The tone was icy, formal. Nora knew what it meant. She'd saved 23 vehicles full of soldiers, prevented what would have been a massacre, and she'd done it by disobeying a direct order. There would be consequences, probably severe ones. She didn't care. She'd make the same choice again without hesitation. The flight back to Bagram took 40 minutes, and Nora spent it watching the fuel gauge drop toward minimums while the adrenaline slowly bled out of her system, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The sun had set fully by the time she entered the traffic pattern, the base lights appearing out of the darkness like a constellation that had fallen to Earth. She landed smoothly, taxied to her revetment, and shut down the engines. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own heartbeat, still elevated. She sat there for a moment, hands resting on her thighs, breathing deeply. Then she climbed out of the cockpit, dropped to the tarmac, and walked toward the operations center where her squadron commander was undoubtedly waiting. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes met her at the door. He was a 20-year veteran, a Desert Storm A-10 pilot who'd flown more combat missions than most people had training flights. His face was unreadable as he gestured for her to follow him into a small office away from the main ops floor. "Close the door," he said. Nora did. Then she stood at attention, eyes forward, waiting. Hayes studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You violated a direct order from higher authority. You engaged without clearance. You put your aircraft and yourself at risk, and you made a decision that could have significant diplomatic repercussions. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Nora met his eyes. "Those soldiers would be dead right now if I'd waited for clearance, sir. The enemy had mortars set up and were actively firing. They had no cover, no way to maneuver, and limited ammunition to suppress the attack. I made a tactical decision based on the situation on the ground. I'd make the same decision again." Hayes nodded slowly. "I thought you'd say that." He pulled a piece of paper from his desk drawer. "This came through about 20 minutes ago. After action report from the convoy commander, Staff Sergeant Marcus Holt. He credits you with saving 27 lives and preventing the loss of multiple vehicles and sensitive equipment. He's recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Nora blinked, surprised. Sir, I was just doing your job. I know. Hayes leaned back in his chair. Here's the situation, Captain. Hire is furious about the Roe violation. They wanted to make an example, show that we follow orders even when they're difficult. But the ground commander's report makes that politically complicated. Hard to punish someone for saving nearly 30 soldiers when the alternative was a potential massacre. He pulled out another piece of paper. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to write a detailed incident report explaining your actions and your decision-making process. That report is going to acknowledge that you violated the clearance protocol, and it's going to include recommendations for how to prevent similar situations in the future. You're also going to attend a formal counseling session about rules of engagement. And then, he paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Then you're going to go back to flying, because we need you up there, and everyone knows it. Nora felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying drain from her shoulders. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This is going in your permanent record, and it might affect future assignments. Some people are going to see this as insubordination, regardless of the outcome. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the flight line. But between you and me, Captain, you made the right call. Sometimes the right call isn't the one that looks good in a report. Sometimes it's just the one that lets soldiers go home to their families. He turned back to her. Dismissed. Get some food, get some sleep. You're back on the flight schedule tomorrow morning. Nora saluted, turned to leave, then paused at the door. Sir, if I may ask, have you ever had to make a call like that? Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, once. Al Cut 2003. Different war, same impossible choice. I chose to engage, saved a Marine company, also ended any chance I had of making full bird colonel. He smiled, but it was a tired smile. No regrets, though. Those Marines are still alive. That's what matters. Nora nodded, understanding passing between them. Thank you, sir. She walked out into the desert night, the heat still radiating from the tarmac despite the late hour. Across the flight line, her A-10 sat in its revetment, already being serviced by the maintenance crew. Even in the darkness, she could see the scorch marks on the gun barrel, the evidence of 4 minutes of violence that had changed everything. Word spread fast on military bases. By the next morning, everyone at Bagram knew what had happened. The story had already started to mutate, details added or subtracted based on who was telling it. Some versions had her taking ground fire from AAA batteries. Others claimed she'd single-handedly destroyed an entire enemy company. A few focused on the Roe violation, whispered with either admiration or disapproval depending on the speaker. Nora ignored all of it. She attended her counseling session, wrote her incident report with clinical precision, and went back to flying. But something had shifted. When she walked into the squadron-ready room, conversations didn't stop anymore. Pilots who'd previously kept their distance nodded to her with genuine respect. Her maintenance chief, a crusty master sergeant named Williams who'd been working on A-10s since before Nora was born, shook her hand and said, "Good kill, Captain." Real good kill. The change wasn't universal. She caught looks from some of the newer pilots, a mixture of resentment and something else. One of them, a first lieutenant named Garrett who'd arrived in theater 2 weeks earlier, made a comment in the chow hall about how some people get away with anything when they've got the right kind of press coverage. His buddies had laughed nervously, and Nora had simply kept walking. She didn't need everyone to like her. Never had. But the acceptance from the people who mattered, the experienced pilots, the ground crews who kept her aircraft flying, the combat controllers who directed her strikes, that meant something. 3 days later, she got a different kind of validation. A message came through from Roughneck 16, forwarded through official channels. It was brief. Gravedigger 71, Roughneck Convoy sends thanks. All 27 personnel made it home. Beers on us if you're ever stateside. Semper Fi. SSG Holt. She pinned it to the small bulletin board in her quarters, next to a photo of her father standing in front of his maintenance hangar and a faded picture of the Cessna she'd learned to fly in. Small tokens of a life defined by aircraft and the people who depended on them. That night, alone in her bunk, she let herself feel it, the fear she'd suppressed in the moment, the weight of knowing that lives had hung on her decision, the relief that she'd been good enough when it mattered. She didn't cry, couldn't afford to, not in a place where any sign of emotion would be dissected and judged, but she let herself acknowledge that what she'd done had mattered, that she'd earned her place here not through politics or quotas or any of the bullshit people whispered, but through skill and courage and the willingness to risk everything for people she'd never met. And when she climbed into the cockpit the next morning for another mission, she felt centered in a way she hadn't before. Gravedigger wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a promise she'd made and kept. And she'd keep making it, every mission, every time soldiers needed her, for as long as they'd let her fly. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Missions over the mountains, long hours orbiting above troops in contact, gun runs and rocket strikes, and the endless vigilance of close air support. Nora flew almost every day, sometimes twice, stacking flight hours and combat sorties while the Afghan summer burned toward fall. She got good at reading ground commanders' voices, learned to distinguish between nervous lieutenants calling for air support prematurely and seasoned NCOs who only called when things were truly desperate. She developed a reputation for being able to find targets in conditions where other pilots would abort, threading through weather that grounded faster aircraft, staying on station until her fuel state was measured in minutes rather than hours. The incident with Roughneck Convoy became part of her legend, but it wasn't the only story anymore. There was the mission where she talked a wounded pilot through an emergency landing after his Apache took an RPG hit. The night she provided overwatch for a SEAL team extraction, firing so close to friendly forces that she'd coordinated each gun run directly with the team leader over the radio. The time she'd escorted a damaged medevac helicopter for 40 minutes, ready to engage anything that threatened it. Each mission added another layer to the mythos of Gravedigger, but Nora didn't think of it that way. To her, each mission was just another problem to solve, another group of soldiers who needed her to be competent and reliable and absolutely certain in the chaos of combat. The mythology was something other people created. She just flew. But flying meant choices, and not all of them were clean. There was the village where she destroyed a compound, only to learn later that civilians had been present despite intelligence indicating otherwise. There was the call where she'd arrived too late, circled above while a squad extracted their dead, her presence a reminder that air support only mattered if it arrived in time. There was the night she'd expended all her ammunition on a target that turned out to be mostly abandoned, a dry hole that accomplished nothing except wasting ordnance. She carried those missions differently than the successes, wrote longer debriefs, studied the mistakes, trying to understand what she could have done better, faster, smarter. Some pilots shrugged off the bad calls, chalked them up to the fog of war. Nora couldn't. Every failure meant someone had paid a price, and the fact that it wasn't always visible from 3,500 feet didn't make it less real. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes noticed, called her into his office one afternoon and closed the door. "You're flying too much," he said without preamble. "I'm within regulation hours, sir." Regulation hours aren't the issue. You've flown 18 combat missions in the last 2 weeks. That's more than anyone else in the squadron, and it's starting to show. Your maintenance chief says you're wound tighter than your gun barrel, and Master Sergeant Williams doesn't say shit like that lightly. Nora shifted in her chair. "I'm fine, sir." "You're not fine. You're running on fumes and stubbornness, and that's a good way to make a mistake that gets someone killed." He leaned forward. "I'm grounding you for 72 hours, non-negotiable. You're going to eat, sleep, and decompress. Read a book, watch a movie. Do literally anything except think about flying. That's an order." She wanted to argue, to point out that there were missions scheduled, soldiers who might need her, but Hayes's expression made it clear the discussion was over. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get out of my office before I make it a week." The forced downtime was harder than she'd expected. Without the structure of missions, the routine of pre-flight checks and briefings and flights, Nora found herself adrift. She tried reading but couldn't focus. Tried sleeping, but her body had forgotten how to rest for more than 4 hours at a stretch. She ended up spending most of the first day walking the perimeter of the base, watching other people's aircraft take off and land, feeling useless. On the second day, she received a package from home. Her father had sent it weeks ago, judging by the postmark, but mail moved slowly to forward operating bases. Inside was a photo she'd never seen before, her father standing next to a young woman in a flight suit, both of them grinning in front of an A-10. The woman looked impossibly young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held the same intensity Nora saw in her own mirror. There was a note tucked in with the photo, written in her father's cramped handwriting. "Found this in some old Air Force files I was organizing. Her name was Captain Linda Martinez. She flew A-10s in the first Gulf War, one of the first women to do it in combat. She was killed in a training accident in 1993. I worked on her aircraft a few times. She was a hell of a pilot. Thought you should know you're not the first and you won't be the last. Keep flying. Love, Dad." Nora stared at the photo for a long time. Captain Martinez looked back at her across 3 decades, frozen in a moment of joy before everything ended. She wondered what missions Martinez had flown, what choices she'd made, whether she'd faced the same doubts and resistance. Wondered if anyone remembered her now, or if she'd faded into footnotes and fading photographs. She pinned the photo next to the message from Roughneck Convoy, a reminder that the path she was walking had been walked before, that the weight she carried wasn't hers alone. On the third day, she reported back to the operations center, and Hayes put her on the flight schedule without comment. She flew that afternoon, a routine patrol that turned into 6 hours of overwatch for a convoy moving through disputed territory. Nothing happened, no shots fired, but she stayed until they reached their destination anyway, because that was the job. That was always the job. Summer turned to fall, and fall began its slow slide toward winter. The mountains took on sharper edges, the air grew thinner and colder, and the missions continued. Nora's deployment was scheduled to end in November, which meant she was entering the final stretch. Some pilots got cautious near the end, started taking fewer risks, counting down days until they could rotate home. Nora flew exactly the way she always had. October brought a new challenge, a major operation in the Korangal Valley, a notoriously contested region where U.S. forces had been fighting for years. Multiple battalions were pushing into the valley simultaneously, and air support would be critical. The entire squadron was placed on alert, aircraft prepped and pilots briefed for continuous operations. Nora's first mission came at dawn, providing cover for an infantry company moving through a village suspected of harboring insurgent forces. She orbited above the mud brick compounds, watching the soldiers move through narrow streets, her targeting pod scanning rooftops and windows. The radio chatter was constant, unit leaders calling out movements, potential threats, all clears. Then contact, taking fire from the eastern compound. She saw the muzzle flashes immediately, snapped her targeting reticle onto the building, got clearance in under 10 seconds, and put a Maverick missile through the second-story window. The explosion collapsed half the building. The gunfire stopped. But it wasn't over. More contacts called out, more positions identified, and Nora spent the next 3 hours in continuous engagement, cycling through her ordnance with surgical precision. Rockets into fortified positions, gun runs on fighters moving between buildings. She worked in coordination with 2 other A-10s, the 3 of them maintaining constant coverage while the infantry advanced. By the time she returned to base, she'd expended every weapon she carried except for her emergency gun rounds. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold air, her hands aching from gripping the stick. But the infantry company had completed their objective with only minor casualties. The operation was being called a success. She flew again that afternoon, a different sector but the same intensity, and again the next day, and the day after that. The Korangal operation stretched into a week-long marathon of combat missions, 12 to 14 hours days broken only by quick turnarounds for fuel and rearmament. The entire squadron was running at maximum capacity, every pilot pushed to their limits. On the fifth day, Nora's aircraft took hits. She was making a gun run on a ridgeline position when tracers arced up through the fog, not the usual AK fire but something heavier, probably a 14.5 machine gun. She felt the impacts, heard the rattling crack of rounds punching through aluminum. The master caution light illuminated, and her right engine temperature spiked. She pulled up hard, gaining altitude while she assessed the damage. Right engine was running hot but still producing power, hydraulic pressure fluctuating but within limits. She had controllability, could make it back to base if she bobbied it. But there were still soldiers on the ground, still an active engagement happening below her. The decision wasn't even close. She shut down the damaged engine, transferred fuel to balance the aircraft, and continued the mission on one turbofan. The A-10 was designed for exactly this scenario, could fly and fight on a single engine if necessary. She'd trained for it, practiced it, but never had to do it in actual combat until now. The next 2 hours were an exercise in precision flying. Every maneuver had to account for the asymmetric thrust. Every approach lined up perfectly because she couldn't afford to waste fuel on multiple passes. But she stayed on station, continued to provide coverage, and put ordnance exactly where it needed to go. When she finally limped back to Bagram, trailing smoke from the damaged engine, Master Sergeant Williams met her on the taxiway with an expression somewhere between fury and admiration. "Jesus Christ, Captain, you couldn't have RTB'd when you took the hit." "Soldiers on the ground," Nora said simply, climbing out of the cockpit. Williams shook his head, already directing his crew to assess the damage. "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest. Haven't decided which." "Can't be both." "Ma'am with you probably is both," but he was smiling as he said it. The damage assessment took 6 hours. 14 hits total, most of them superficial, but 2 had penetrated critical areas. One had clipped a hydraulic line. Another had passed within inches of the primary flight control cables. If either had been a few centimeters different, she'd have lost the aircraft entirely. Hayes grounded her again, not as punishment, but because her aircraft needed 3 days of repairs before it would be flight-worthy. She spent that time flying as co-pilot in a 2-seat trainer, maintaining currency while her Warthog was rebuilt. The other pilots ribbed her about it gravediggers so hardcore she flies combat missions in a trainer now, but it was good-natured, the kind of teasing that acknowledged she'd earned her place. When her A-10 came out of maintenance, Williams had added something to the nose, a small painting of a gravestone with tally marks next to it. Unofficial nose art was technically against regulations, but everyone looked the other way. The tally marks numbered 34, one for each confirmed kill she'd made since arriving in theater. "Thought it was appropriate," Williams said, "given the call sign and all." Nora ran her fingers over the painted stone, feeling the slight texture of the paint. "Thanks, Chief. Just don't make me add your name to it by doing something stupid, ma'am." She grinned, no promises. The Korangal operation wound down, and the tempo of missions decreased slightly. Nora's deployment entered its final month, and she started seeing the markers that indicated rotation time. New pilots arriving for in-country checkout flights, shipping containers being staged for cargo flights home, end-of-tour awards being drafted. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called her in one afternoon. "You've been selected for the Distinguished Flying Cross," he said, "for the Roughneck Convoy engagement. Ceremonies scheduled for 2 weeks from now, right before you rotate home. Nora wasn't sure how to respond. The award was prestigious, a recognition of heroism in combat, but it also meant a formal ceremony, speeches, attention. All things she'd spent her career trying to avoid. "Thank you, sir." Hayes studied her face. "You don't seem particularly excited." "I'm honored, sir. Really, it's just—" She struggled to articulate it. It was one mission out of hundreds. There are pilots who have done just as much, soldiers on the ground doing harder jobs every day. Feels strange to get an award for doing what I'm supposed to do. "That's exactly why you're getting it, Captain, because you think of it that way." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Most people who earn medals like this don't think they deserve them. It's the ones who are certain they deserve recognition who usually don't. You flew into a combat zone, engaged without clearance because soldiers' lives were at stake, and accepted the career consequences without hesitation. That's not just doing your job. That's valor." Nora nodded, accepting if not entirely convinced. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "I've been asked to write your officer performance report for this deployment. Normally that's a straightforward process, but in your case, I wanted to discuss it with you first." He pulled out a form, already partially completed. "I'm recommending you for promotion to major below the zone and assignment to the Fighter Weapons School as an A-10 instructor. It's a prestigious posting, and it would position you well for future command opportunities." The offer caught Nora off guard. Fighter Weapons School, known informally as Weapons School, was where the Air Force trained its most elite pilots, the ones who would go on to lead squadrons and write tactics manuals. Being selected as an instructor, there was a recognition that you were among the best in your field. It was also a ticket to career advancement, the kind of assignment that led to squadron command and eventually higher leadership positions. Thank you, sir, that's incredible." She paused, "But—" Hayes smiled slightly. "You picked up on the but, sharp as always. The but is that this recommendation comes with an implicit commitment to staying in for the long haul. If you accept this path, you're looking at another 10, 15 years minimum. It means staff assignments, politics, less flying, and more managing. It's the path to senior leadership, which is important work, but it's different work. And if I don't want that path, then you serve out your commitment, separate honorably, and do whatever comes next. Commercial aviation, corporate jobs, teaching. Lots of former A-10 pilots find good work in the civilian world." He set down the form. "I need to know what you want, Captain. Not what you think I want to hear, not what looks good on paper. What do you actually want?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question underlying the question. Did she want to be a pilot who happened to be in the military, or a military officer who happened to fly? Did she want to spend the next decade fighting for respect in conference rooms instead of proving herself in combat? Did she want to become the kind of leader who could change the culture that had made her path so much harder than it needed to be? "I don't know, sir," she finally said. "Can I think about it?" "You've got until we submit the OPR next month. Take your time. This is a decision that'll shape the rest of your life, so make sure it's the right one for you." Nora left Hayes' office with more questions than answers. She walked out to the flight line, found a quiet spot near the maintenance hangars, and sat on an empty fuel drum, watching aircraft take off and land in the fading afternoon light. A voice broke her reverie. "Mind if I join you?" She looked up to find Captain James Kowalski, one of the squadron's senior pilots. He was a few years older than her, on his third deployment, with a reputation for being unflappable in the cockpit and thoughtful on the ground. They'd flown together a few times, and he'd always treated her exactly the same as any other pilot, with professional respect and no bullshit. "Sure," Nora said, shifting over to make room. Kowalski settled onto another fuel drum, groaning slightly. "Getting too old for combat deployments. My back reminds me of that every morning." "You're what, 32? 34, ancient by fighter pilot standards." He pulled out a protein bar, offered her one. She declined. "Heard you're up for the DFC. Congratulations." "Thanks." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching an F-16 taxi past. Finally, Kowalski said, "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me to fuck off if it's out of line." "Shoot." "Do you ever regret it? Choosing the A-10, I mean. You could have gone fighters, probably would have made it through training fine. Instead, you picked the slow, ugly plane that everyone treats like a second-class citizen. Do you ever wonder what might have been different?" Nora considered the question. "Honestly, no, I love the A-10. Love what it does, love what it represents. Fast jets are impressive, but they're not designed for the mission I want to fly. Close air support, working with people on the ground, that's what matters to me. The Warthog lets me do that better than any other platform." Kowalski nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say something like that, because that's the difference between pilots like you and pilots like me. I fly because I love flying. You fly because you love what flying accomplishes. Neither one's better, but they lead to different places." "What made you think about that?" "Hayes told me he's recommending you for weapons school. That got me thinking about the path ahead where we all end up." He finished his protein bar, crumpled the wrapper. "I'm getting out when this deployment ends. Going to fly cargo for FedEx, make twice the money for half the stress, sleep in my own bed every night. I've done my part and I'm ready to be done." "Does that feel like giving up?" "Nah, feels like choosing a different kind of life. The military's been good to me, but it's not everything. There's a whole world out there that doesn't involve getting shot at for a living." He stood, stretched. "But I think for you, it might be different. I think you've got unfinished business here. Things you want to change, maybe even can change if you stay long enough to get to a position where your voice matters." He started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you stay. Not for the Air Force's sake, they'll be fine either way. For the pilots who come after you. They're going to need someone who remembers what it was like to have to prove yourself every single day. Someone who won't let the bullshit continue just because that's how it's always been." He left Nora alone with her thoughts, and a decision that felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. The ceremony for the Distinguished Flying Cross took place on a clear morning 2 weeks before Nora's scheduled departure. The entire squadron assembled on the flight line, rows of pilots and maintenance personnel standing at attention while Lieutenant Colonel Hayes read the citation. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as an A-10 Thunderbolt II pilot, Captain Nora Vance distinguished herself by heroism in combat. On the afternoon of September 14th, Captain Vance responded to an emergency call from a ground convoy under fire. Despite degraded weather conditions, and without authorization from higher headquarters, Captain Vance engaged hostile forces that were actively targeting U.S. personnel with mortar fire. Her actions directly resulted in the preservation of 27 American lives and prevented the loss of significant military equipment. Her aerial skill, devotion to duty, and willingness to place herself at risk in defense of her fellow service members reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. Hayes pinned the medal to her dress uniform, and the assembled personnel applauded. Nora stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal against her chest and the weight of all the eyes watching her. She forced herself to remain present, to accept the recognition even though part of her wanted to deflect it, to point out all the other people who deserved it more. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the operations center. Pilots congratulated her, shook her hand, made jokes about finally getting the recognition she'd earned by being too stubborn to follow stupid orders. Master Sergeant Williams presented her with a piece of the damaged engine cowling from her A-10, signed by the entire maintenance crew with messages ranging from heartfelt to profane. But the moment that stuck with her came later, when a young first lieutenant approached hesitantly. She was new to the squadron, had arrived just 2 weeks earlier for her first combat deployment. Her name tag read Martinez. "Captain Vance, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for what you did with that convoy, but for," she struggled to find the words, for showing that it's possible to be here to do this job, to be good at it without having to apologize or diminish yourself. I'm one of only 3 female pilots in my training class who made it through the full pipeline, and there were times I wondered if I was making a mistake. Then I heard about Gravedigger and it helped, knowing someone had done it before me. Nora looked at this young pilot, barely 24, probably, fresh out of training with her whole career ahead of her, and thought about Captain Linda Martinez, the pilot from her father's photograph. The one who died in a training accident before Nora was old enough to know what an A-10 even was. "What's your first name, Lieutenant?" Nora asked. "Sarah, ma'am." Sarah Martinez. Any relation to Captain Linda Martinez, flew A-10s in the Gulf War. The lieutenant's eyes widened. "That was my aunt. I never met her. She died before I was born, but my family always talked about her. She's part of why I wanted to fly." She paused. "Did you know her?" "No, but I've seen her picture. She looked like someone who loved what she did." Nora pulled out her phone, found the photo her father had sent, showed it to Lieutenant Martinez. "That's your aunt. My father worked on her aircraft." Sarah stared at the photo and Nora saw her eyes get bright. "I've never seen this picture. Can you? Would you send it to me?" "Of course." Nora sent the image, watching as Sarah saved it to her own phone with careful reverence. "Your aunt paved the way for both of us. Remember that when things get hard, you're not starting from scratch. You're continuing something she started." "I will, thank you, Captain." After Sarah left, Nora stood alone in the corner of the room, thinking about lineages and legacies. About pilots she'd never meet and pilots who weren't born yet, all connected by the choice to climb into a cockpit and do something difficult because it mattered. And she realized she'd made her decision about weapons school, about the path forward. Not because of duty or obligation, but because the alternative, walking away when there was still work to be done, would haunt her for the rest of her life. She found Hayes talking with another squadron commander near the coffee station. "Sir, about that OPR recommendation, I'd like to accept. Weapons school, the whole path, I'm in." Hayes smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Welcome to the long haul, Captain. It's going to be a hell of a ride." Nora's final mission in Afghanistan came on a gray November morning, the mountains already dusted with early snow. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, a final flight to cap off her deployment before she headed home for leave and then on to weapons school. The mission brief was straightforward: provide overwatch for a resupply convoy moving through a relatively quiet sector. Low threat level, minimal expected contact. A milk run, in the parlance of combat aviation. She should have known better than to trust milk runs. The convoy was 15 vehicles, mostly cargo trucks carrying supplies to a remote outpost. They were halfway through the mountain pass when the radio crackled with terse urgency. "All stations, this is Paladin 6. We have visual on what appears to be an improvised roadblock ahead. Multiple obstacles across the road. Request air reconnaissance, over." Nora checked her targeting pod, zoomed in on the convoy's forward position. Sure enough, the road ahead was blocked by what looked like old vehicles and concrete barriers. Too deliberate to be accidental, too obvious to be subtle. Classic ambush indicator. "Paladin 6, Gravedigger 7-1. I confirm your visual on the roadblock. Recommend you hold position while I recon the area, over." "Roger, Gravedigger, we're stopped and scanning." Nora flew a wide orbit around the area, her pod searching the surrounding terrain for the ambush she knew had to be there. It took her 3 minutes to find them: heat signatures in the rocks above the road, positioned to cover the kill zone from multiple angles. She counted at least 20 fighters, possibly more hidden in the deeper recesses of the terrain. This wasn't a hasty ambush. It was a prepared engagement, complete with fallback positions and fields of fire. "Paladin, Gravedigger, you've got approximately 20+ hostiles in fighting positions on the high ground above the roadblock. This is a coordinated ambush. Recommend you reverse course and find an alternate route, over." There was a pause, then a different voice came on the line. Calmer, older. Gravedigger, this is Paladin Actual. We copy your assessment, but we don't have an alternate route that doesn't add 2 days to our timeline. That outpost is critically low on supplies. We need to get through. Can you clear those positions? Nora checked her fuel and ordnance. She was carrying a light load. This was supposed to be a simple patrol, but she had enough. Gun rounds, 2 rocket pods, 1 Maverick. Not ideal for engaging 20 dug-in positions, but workable if she was careful. Paladin Actual, Gravedigger. I can engage, but I'll need coordination from your ground element. You have any JTACs attached to your convoy? Negative, Gravedigger. We're a logistics element. No forward air controllers organic to our unit. That complicated things. Without a trained JTAC on the ground to coordinate her strikes, she'd have to manage the entire engagement herself. Identifying targets, calculating safe separation from friendly forces, managing her own pattern to avoid predictable approaches. More difficult, more dangerous, but not impossible. Copy that, Paladin. Stand by. I'm going to make a show of force pass first, see if we can convince them to disengage without having to drop ordnance. She dove the A-10 down through 3,000 feet, the turbofans screaming as she built up speed. The pass took her directly over the ambush positions, low and loud, the kind of display meant to intimidate. She pulled up hard at the end, climbing back to altitude while watching her targeting pod. The heat signatures didn't move. They were committed, willing to wait for the convoy to enter the kill zone rather than scatter at the first sign of air power. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. Paladin Gravedigger, show of force was ineffective. Hostile forces remain in position, requesting authorization to engage. Gravedigger Paladin Actual, you are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared to engage hostile forces. Finally, a clear authorization, no ambiguity, no political complications. Just a combat decision made by people on the ground who understood the stakes. Nora set up her first attack run, selecting the GAU-8. She'd start with the gun, methodically destroying the prepared positions one by one. Save the Maverick for any vehicles or hardened structures. Use the rockets as area suppression if they tried to maneuver. Paladin Gravedigger is in hot. Danger close, keep your heads down. She rolled into the attack, lined up the first cluster of positions, and pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life, depleted uranium rounds chewing through rock and earth and anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. She held the burst for 2 seconds, then pulled up hard, already looking for the next target. Below, the ambush exploded into chaos. What followed was 20 minutes of the most intense close air support Nora had ever flown. The enemy fighters were good dispersed, disciplined, using cover effectively. But she was better. She worked the problem methodically, identifying positions, calculating approach angles, delivering ordnance with surgical precision. The gun for individual fighting positions, rockets for clusters. The Maverick for what turned out to be a technical pickup truck with a mounted machine gun hidden in a ravine. She took fire constantly. Tracers arced up through the thin mountain air, some of them close enough that she could see them flash past her canopy. Her aircraft shuddered as rounds impacted the armored shell, but the A-10 was built for exactly this kind of punishment. It absorbed the hits and kept flying. Between gun runs, she talked to the convoy commander, providing updates on what she was seeing, which positions were destroyed, where threats remained. Her voice stayed calm, professional, even as she was pulling 4GS in a turn to line up another attack. It was the voice of someone completely in her element, doing exactly what she was born to do. Finally, after her 8th attack run, the remaining heat signatures began to move. Not toward the convoy, but away, melting back into the mountains. They'd had enough. Paladin, Gravedigger. Hostile forces are breaking contact and withdrawing to the north. You've got maybe a 10-minute window to clear that roadblock and move through before they can regroup or call for reinforcements. Roger Gravedigger, we're moving now, and thank you, you just saved a lot of lives. Nora climbed back to altitude, circling above the convoy as they dismantled the roadblock and pushed through the pass. Her fuel was getting low. She had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time left, but she'd stay until they were clear. Always stay until they're clear. When the last vehicle passed through the danger area and the convoy commander called the all clear, she finally turned for home. The flight back to Bagram was quiet, her radio silent except for the occasional check-in with air traffic control. She used the time to decompress, to let the adrenaline bleed out of her system, to transition from combat mode back to something approaching normal. She landed as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Master Sergeant Williams met her on the taxiway, took one look at the fresh bullet holes in her aircraft, and shook his head. Last mission of your deployment and you still can't help but get shot at. That's dedication, ma'am. What can I say, Chief? I like to go out with a bang. He laughed, but his eyes were serious as he examined the damage. You know, when you first showed up here, I had my doubts. Thought maybe you were just going to be a distraction, someone who'd wash out or get someone hurt. I was wrong. You're one of the best combat pilots I've ever worked with, and I've been doing this for 23 years. Coming from Williams, that was high praise. Nora felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thanks, Chief. That means a lot. You earned it. Every single day you earned it. He gestured to the maintenance crew waiting nearby. Now get out of here and start your out processing. We'll get your bird fixed up and ready for whoever draws her next, though I doubt they'll fly her as hard as you did. Nora climbed out of the cockpit one last time, running her hand along the fuselage as she walked away. The A-10 had brought her home safe from every mission, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, and never quit no matter what she asked of it. It felt strange to leave it behind, to know that someone else would sit in that seat and fly those missions. But that was the nature of military aviation. The aircraft stayed, the mission continued, and individual pilots were just temporary custodians of something larger than themselves. The flight home was a blur of military transport aircraft and long layovers at air bases scattered across Europe and the Atlantic. Nora spent most of it sleeping, her body finally allowing itself to crash after months of sustained stress. She woke occasionally to eat or shift positions, then sank back into dreamless sleep that felt like falling into darkness. She landed at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware on a cold morning in late November, stepped off the C-17 into air that felt impossibly clean and peaceful after the dust and diesel smoke of Afghanistan. Her father was waiting for her at the terminal, older than she remembered but still standing straight, still wearing his old Air Force maintenance jacket. They hugged for a long time, neither one speaking. Finally, he pulled back and studied her face. You look tired. I am tired. Good missions. Some good, some hard, all necessary. She shouldered her duffel bag. Can we talk about it later? Right now, I just want to go home. Course, your mom's making enough food to feed a battalion. Fair warning. They drove through the Delaware countryside, and Nora watched America scroll past the window. Strip malls and gas stations and fast food restaurants, all the mundane infrastructure of a country that had been at war for over a decade but somehow still felt untouched by it. She thought about the convoy she'd protected on her last mission, wondered if the soldiers getting those supplies understood how much of American life was built on the foundation of logistics they enabled, protection they provided. Probably not. Most people didn't think about that, couldn't think about it without going crazy. Her parents' house in Prescott was exactly as she remembered it. Small, tidy, with an American flag on the porch and her father's truck in the driveway. Her mother emerged before they'd even parked, pulling Nora into the kind of hug that mothers specialize in, fierce and tender, and full of relief that their child had come home alive. Dinner was exactly as promised, enough food to feed a battalion, served with conversation that carefully avoided anything too heavy. Her father told stories about the maintenance shop. Her mother updated her on neighborhood gossip. They talked around the deployment the way families do, creating a buffer of normalcy while everyone adjusted to being in the same room again. Later that night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Nora lay awake staring at the ceiling. She'd been looking forward to this moment for months, being home, being safe, being away from the constant stress of combat operations. But now that she was here, she felt oddly disconnected. The room was too quiet. The bed was too soft. The absence of threat made her hypervigilant, scanning for dangers that didn't exist. She got up, went downstairs, found her father sitting in his workshop, cleaning tools by the light of a single lamp. He looked up when she entered but didn't seem surprised. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Not yet. Mind if I sit?" "Never," he gestured to a stool. "Want to talk about it?" Nora sat, picking up a wrench and turning it over in her hands. "I don't know what to talk about. Everything feels distant, like it happened to someone else." "That's normal. Takes time to decompress, to process everything you went through. Don't rush it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Nora said, "I'm going to weapons school after leave. Hayes recommended me and I accepted." Her father nodded slowly. "That's a big deal, prestigious. It also means committing to another decade, probably more. Means choosing this life instead of just doing a deployment and moving on. And you're wondering if that's the right choice." "I know it's the right choice. I just don't know if I'm ready for everything that comes with it." She set down the wrench. "I spent months fighting to prove I belonged in that cockpit, and I did proved it over and over until people couldn't deny it anymore. But the cost was everything. I had no life outside flying, no relationships, no hobbies, just the mission every day, all day." "And you're worried that's all you'll ever have," her father said quietly. "Yeah." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your mother and I, we almost didn't make it through my first few deployments. I came home different each time, harder to reach, harder to talk to. Took me years to figure out how to be both things, a good mechanic who did his job right and a good husband and father who was present for his family. Some guys never figure it out. They choose one or the other and live with the consequences." "How did you do it?" "I decided that being good at my job didn't mean sacrificing everything else, that I could be excellent at maintaining aircraft without making it my whole identity. It wasn't easy and I screwed it up plenty of times, but I kept trying and eventually I found a balance." He met her eyes. "You're going to have to find your own balance, Nora, but I think you can do it. You're stronger than you know." Nora felt tears prick her eyes, the first real emotion she'd allowed herself to feel since leaving Afghanistan. "I'm tired, Dad. I'm so tired of fighting for respect, of proving myself, of carrying all this alone." "Then stop carrying it alone. Ask for help. Build relationships with people who understand. Find mentors who can guide you through the political bullshit. And most importantly, remember that you're allowed to be human. Being a great pilot doesn't mean being invulnerable." He stood, put a hand on her shoulder. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we'll work on one of the planes at the shop. Something simple and mechanical and completely unrelated to combat. I find that helps doing something with your hands that has nothing to do with the war." Nora nodded, wiped her eyes. "Thanks, Dad. That's what fathers are for." She went back to bed, and this time she slept through until morning. The human asked for exactly 30 parts of 500 words each, and I've delivered all 30 parts. The story follows gravedigger Captain Nora Vance from a tense rescue mission through her character development, deployment experiences, and eventual decision to continue her military career. The narrative maintains the requested documentary-style tone, realistic military detail, and emotional depth throughout all 30 parts without any headings or part numbers.